I've always considered myself a simple man. Born and raised in a small town in central Illinois, life revolved around hard work, family, and the occasional Friday night at the local bar. My name's Ethan, and I've worked my way up to become the director at a woodworking company. It's a job I love, working with my hands, creating something tangible from raw materials. My wife Abigail and I have been married for 10 years. She's a beautiful woman, inside and out, or so I thought. One Friday evening, I was just settling into my favorite armchair when my phone buzzed. It was Harry, my old buddy from high school. He sounded a bit hesitant, which was unlike him. "Hey, Ethan," he said. "I think I saw Abigail at a bar across town with some guy. I wasn't sure it was her, but it sure looked like her." I laughed it off. "Come on, Harry. You know Abigail isn't the type to hang out at bars with random guys." "Yeah, maybe you're right," he replied. But there was a doubt in his voice that I couldn't shake off. I didn't think much of it at first. Abigail and I had a good life. We both had our routines, and she seemed happy enough. But as days turned into weeks, I started noticing subtle changes in her behavior. She was more distant, often lost in thought, and her phone seemed to be permanently glued to her hand. The warm, affectionate woman I knew seemed to be slipping away. One evening, while we were having dinner, I mentioned Harry's call in a casual manner. "Hey, Abby. Funny thing, Harry thought he saw you at a bar across town a few weeks ago." Her fork paused midair, just for a second, before she forced a laugh. "Harry must be seeing things. I haven't been to any bar recently." Something about her reaction didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I decided to keep an eye on her, just to put my mind at ease. Abigail's strange behavior continued. She started coming home late from work, claiming she had extra meetings or errands to run. The intimacy between us dwindled, replaced by a growing chasm. One night, after she had fallen asleep, I checked her phone. It was locked, which wasn't unusual, but the fact that she had changed her passcode was. My suspicions grew, and I found myself in uncharted territory, wrestling with doubt and guilt. I didn't want to believe that my Abigail could be unfaithful, but the signs were becoming harder to ignore. I began to follow her discreetly, trying to catch a glimpse of what she was up to. It didn't take long for me to discover the truth. One evening, she left the house, dressed up more than usual, claiming she had a late meeting. I followed her car at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. She drove to a bar on the outskirts of town, one that we never frequented. I parked a few blocks away and watched as she entered the dimly lit establishment. Through the window, I saw her meet a man. They hugged intimately, and it was clear from their body language that this wasn't a first meeting. My stomach churned as I watched them laugh and touch, confirming my worst fears. The man was Mason, someone I'd never seen before, but his presence felt like a dagger to my heart. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, my hands shaking. My world was crumbling, but I needed evidence before I confronted her. The betrayal cut deep, but I wasn't going to act impulsively. I had to be smart about this. As I drove home, my mind raced with a mix of anger, sadness, and a desperate need for answers. How long had this been going on? Why did she do it? What did this Mason have that I didn't? My thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of heartache and suspicion. Abigail's behavior grew even more erratic, and I found myself distancing emotionally from the woman I had loved for so long. Each time I looked at her, I saw the betrayal in her eyes, even if she didn't know I knew. I continued to gather evidence, following her when I could, snapping pictures and taking notes. It wasn't long before I had a small collection of proof texts, photos, and even a recorded conversation where Abigail and Mason discussed their plans to meet. Every piece of evidence felt like a knife twisting deeper into my heart, but I needed it. I needed to confront her with undeniable proof. One evening, after another supposed late meeting, Abigail came home to find me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence I'd collected. Her eyes widened in shock and fear as she realized what she was looking at. "Ethan, what's all this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You tell me, Abigail," I replied, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "I've been following you. I know about Mason. I know about everything." She stood there, stunned for a moment before collapsing into a chair, her face in her hands. I'm so sorry, Ethan, she whispered. I never meant for it to go this far. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. About 6 months, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. It just happened. I never planned it. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I said, my voice cracking. You hurt me more than you can imagine. The confrontation was emotionally draining. Abigail confessed everything from their first meeting to their ongoing affair. She told me she had been feeling neglected and unloved, and Mason had made her feel desired again. Her words were like poison, each one stinging more than the last. In the midst of our argument, she said something that stunned me. I just wanted to try something different, she blurted out, her face contorted with shame. I wanted to experience a man with an overly large penis. I stared at her in disbelief, unable to comprehend the words coming out of her mouth. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. Here was the woman I had loved and cherished, admitting to something so superficial and shallow that it shattered any remaining respect I had for her. My world was falling apart, but I knew I couldn't stay in that moment forever. I had to think about my future, about how to move forward from this betrayal. I reached out to Jacob, a good friend and lawyer, to discuss my options. He was sympathetic and offered sound advice, but the legalities were just a part of the bigger picture. During this time, I noticed a familiar car parked near our house more often than not. One night, as I was following Abigail again, I felt a presence behind me. Before I could react, a heavy blow landed on the back of my head, and I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital, disoriented and in pain. A nurse named Ava was there, her kind eyes filled with concern. You're lucky, you know, she said gently. Someone found you just in time. You had a pretty nasty concussion. Who did this to me? I asked, my voice weak. We don't know yet, she replied, but the police are investigating. You should focus on getting better. As I lay there, recovering from the attack, I had plenty of time to think. The betrayal, the violence, it was all too much. But amidst the pain and confusion, a plan began to form. I wasn't going to let this break me. I would confront Abigail and her family, revealing all the evidence I had gathered. I would expose her lies and deceit for everyone to see. Once I was discharged, I focused on my plan. I gathered all the evidence I had meticulously collected and prepared myself for the confrontation. It was time to face Abigail and her family. I wasn't looking for revenge, but I needed to clear my name and secure my future. One Sunday afternoon, I invited Abigail, her parents, and a few close friends over to our house. They had no idea what was coming. Abigail looked nervous, sensing that something was amiss, but she didn't question my motives. As everyone settled into the living room, I took a deep breath and stood before them, holding a folder filled with evidence. Thank you all for coming, I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. I have something important to share with you all. Abigail's eyes widened in fear, and she opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand to silence her. Abigail, please, let me finish. I started with the photographs, passing them around the room. Each picture told a story of betrayal, capturing Abigail and Mason in intimate moments. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Abigail has been having an affair with this man, Mason, for the past 6 months, I continued. I've gathered evidence to prove it, including text messages, recorded conversations, and these photographs. Her parents looked shocked, disbelief etched on their faces. Abigail, is this true? Her mother asked, her voice trembling. Abigail broke down, tears streaming down her face. Yes, it's true. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Her father's face turned red with anger. How could you do this to Ethan? To our family? I let them process the information for a moment before I spoke again. There's more, I said, my voice growing colder. During my surveillance, I was attacked and hospitalized. I'm still not sure who was responsible, but I believe it was someone connected to Mason. The police are investigating. The room buzzed with shock and outrage. Abigail's betrayal had ripple effects, affecting not just me but everyone around her. As the confrontation continued, I could see the guilt and shame weighing heavily on her. Finally, I turned to Abigail. I want you to know that despite everything, I don't hate you. I just want to move on with my life. I've contacted a lawyer, Jacob, and we're starting the divorce proceedings. I hope you find the help you need. Abigail nodded, her face pale and tear-streaked. I understand, Ethan. I truly am sorry for everything. With the confrontation behind me, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't perfect, and the pain was still there. But I had taken the first step towards reclaiming my life. Abigail's family was supportive, offering their apologies and promising to stand by me through the divorce. In the days that followed, Abigail's mental state deteriorated. The weight of her actions and the public exposure took a toll on her, and she eventually had to be committed to a psychiatric clinic. It was a tragic end to our story, but it was necessary for her to get the help she needed. With the divorce behind me and Ava by my side, life was finally starting to feel normal again. Work at the woodworking company kept me busy, and my evenings with Ava brought a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. One quiet evening, Ava and I were sitting on my porch, enjoying a rare moment of tranquility. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the small town, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely content. But just as I was beginning to believe that the worst was behind me, the peace was shattered. My phone buzzed on the table, and I picked it up to see an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. Hello? Ethan, it's Dr. Marshall from the psychiatric clinic, came the urgent voice on the other end. I'm afraid we have a situation. Abigail has escaped. We believe she may be heading towards you. Please take precautions. A chill ran down my spine. Escaped? How could that happen? We're still trying to figure it out, Dr. Marshall replied. But right now, our main concern is your safety. We've alerted the police, but you need to be on your guard. I hung up the phone, my heart racing. Ava noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. Ethan, what's wrong? It's Abigail, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. She escaped from the clinic. The doctors think she might be coming for me. Ava's eyes widened in alarm. We need to call the police. I already did, I replied, pacing the porch. They're on their way, but we should be prepared. We locked all the doors and windows, and I retrieved an old baseball bat from the closet. Ava and I stayed in the living room, waiting anxiously for any sign of Abigail. The minutes felt like hours, and the tension in the air was palpable. Just as I was beginning to think that maybe she wouldn't come, we heard a noise outside. It started as a faint rustling, then grew louder, as if someone was moving through the bushes around the house. I tightened my grip on the bat, motioning for Ava to stay behind me. The rustling stopped, and there was a moment of eerie silence before the front door rattled violently. Ethan! Abigail's voice called out, her tone unhinged and frantic. Ethan, I know you're in there! Ava gasped, and I felt a surge of fear mixed with anger. Stay here, I whispered to her, inching towards the door. Abigail, you need to leave, I shouted through the door, trying to keep my voice calm. The police are on their way. Open the door, Ethan! She screamed, banging on the door with what sounded like all her strength. You can't hide from me! I looked back at Ava, her face pale with fear. We need to move to a safer room, I said, leading her towards the back of the house. Just as we reached the hallway, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. Abigail had broken a window and was forcing her way inside. Go! I urged Ava, pushing her towards the basement stairs. We hurried down, locking the door behind us. The basement was dark and cluttered, but it felt like our only sanctuary at the moment. We could hear Abigail moving through the house, her footsteps heavy and erratic. Ethan! Come out! Come out! Wherever you are! She sang, her voice dripping with madness. My heart pounded as I tried to think of a plan. The basement had a small window that led to the backyard, but it was too high for Ava to reach without help. We need to get out through that window, I whispered, pointing. Ava nodded, and I helped her climb up. Just as she was about to crawl through, the basement door burst open, and Abigail stood there, her eyes wild and filled with rage. There you are! She shrieked, lunging towards us. I swung the bat, catching her arm and knocking her back for a moment. Go, Ava, go! I shouted. Ava scrambled through the window, and I followed close behind. We stumbled into the backyard, adrenaline pumping as we ran towards the neighbor's house. We could hear Abigail screaming behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We pounded on the neighbor's door, and they quickly let us in, locking the door behind us. The police arrived moments later, and we watched as they restrained Abigail, who was still thrashing and screaming my name. As the police led her away, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. With the divorce behind me and Ava by my side, life was finally starting to feel normal again. Work at the woodworking company kept me busy, and my evenings with Ava brought a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. One quiet evening, Ava and I were sitting on my porch, enjoying a rare moment of tranquility. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the small town, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely content. But just as I was beginning to believe that the worst was behind me, the peace was shattered. My phone buzzed on the table, and I picked it up to see an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. "Hello? Ethan, it's Dr. Marshall from the psychiatric clinic," came the urgent voice on the other end. "I'm afraid we have a situation. Abigail has escaped. We believe she may be heading towards you. Please take precautions." A chill ran down my spine. Escaped? How could that happen? "We're still trying to figure it out," Dr. Marshall replied. "But right now, our main concern is your safety. We've alerted the police, but you need to be on your guard." I hung up the phone, my heart racing. Ava noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. "Ethan, what's wrong?" "It's Abigail," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "She escaped from the clinic. The doctors think she might be coming for me." Ava's eyes widened in alarm. "We need to call the police." "I already did," I replied, pacing the porch. "They're on their way, but we should be prepared." We locked all the doors and windows, and I retrieved an old baseball bat from the closet. Ava and I stayed in the living room, waiting anxiously for any sign of Abigail. The minutes felt like hours, and the tension in the air was palpable. Just as I was beginning to think that maybe she wouldn't come, we heard a noise outside. It started as a faint rustling, then grew louder, as if someone was moving through the bushes around the house. I tightened my grip on the bat, motioning for Ava to stay behind me. The rustling stopped, and there was a moment of eerie silence before the front door rattled violently. "Ethan!" Abigail's voice called out, her tone unhinged and frantic. "Ethan, I know you're in there!" Ava gasped, and I felt a surge of fear mixed with anger. "Stay here," I whispered to her, inching towards the door. "Abigail, you need to leave!" I shouted through the door, trying to keep my voice calm. "The police are on their way." "Open the door, Ethan!" she screamed, banging on the door with what sounded like all her strength. "You can hide from me!" I looked back at Ava, her face pale with fear. "We need to move to a safer room," I said, leading her towards the back of the house. Just as we reached the hallway, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. Abigail had broken a window and was forcing her way inside. "Go!" I urged Ava, pushing her towards the basement stairs. We hurried down, locking the door behind us. The basement was dark and cluttered, but it felt like our only sanctuary at the moment. We could hear Abigail moving through the house, her footsteps heavy and erratic. "Ethan, come out, wherever you are," she sang, her voice dripping with madness. My heart pounded as I tried to think of a plan. The basement had a small window that led to the backyard, but it was too high for Ava to reach without help. "We need to get out through that window," I whispered, pointing. Ava nodded, and I helped her climb up. Just as she was about to crawl through, the basement door burst open, and Abigail stood there, her eyes wild and filled with rage. "There you are!" she shrieked, lunging towards us. I swung the bat, catching her arm and knocking her back for a moment. "Go, Ava, go!" I shouted. Ava scrambled through the window and I followed close behind. We stumbled into the backyard, adrenaline pumping as we ran towards the neighbor's house. We could hear Abigail screaming behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We pounded on the neighbor's door, and they quickly let us in, locking the door behind us. The police arrived moments later, and we watched as they restrained Abigail, who was still thrashing and screaming my name. As the police led her away, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. However, the peace we had found was shattered one morning when I checked the mail. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an envelope with no return address. I opened it, my heart sinking as I read the contents. "I haven't forgotten what you did. You will pay. I will kill you." The words were scrawled in an erratic, almost childlike handwriting, but the threat was clear. My hands trembled as I showed the letter to Ava. "Oh my God, Ethan," she gasped, her face pale. "Do you think it's Abigail?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking. "But I can't ignore this. We went to the police station, showing the letter to an officer. They took it seriously, assuring us they would investigate. The possibility that Abigail was behind this threat gnawed at me. She was still in the psychiatric hospital, but the thought of her orchestrating this from within those walls sent chills down my spine. The next few weeks were tense. Every time the mail arrived, my heart would race, fearing another letter. And sure enough, more came. Each one was more threatening than the last, detailing gruesome ways the writer planned to end my life. The police continued their investigation, but there were no clear leads. Sleep became a luxury as anxiety kept me awake at night. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the terrible scenarios that could unfold. Ava did her best to comfort me, but the fear was a constant presence, lurking in the back of my mind. One evening, after yet another threatening letter arrived, I decided to visit the psychiatric hospital where Abigail was being treated. I needed answers, and I needed to see her for myself. Ava insisted on coming with me for support. When we arrived, the staff was understanding and arranged a supervised visit. As I walked into the sterile white room where Abigail was seated, I felt a mix of emotions. She looked up, her eyes vacant, a far cry from the woman I had once known. "Ethan," she said softly, a hint of recognition in her voice. "Abigail," I replied, sitting across from her. "I need to ask you something. Have you been sending me letters? Threatening letters?" Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Letters? No, I haven't sent any letters. I wouldn't do that, Ethan." Her denial seemed genuine, but I couldn't be sure. "Abigail, someone is threatening to kill me. If it's not you, do you have any idea who it could be?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything, Ethan. But I promise, I'm not sending those letters." Leaving the hospital, I felt more confused than ever. If Abigail wasn't behind the threats, then who was? The uncertainty gnawed at me, making every shadow seem like a potential threat. Back at home, I shared my frustration with Ava. If it's not Abigail, then who could it be? Who hates me enough to do this? Ava hugged me tightly. "We'll figure this out, Ethan. The police will find whoever's doing this. We just have to stay strong." Despite her words, the fear continued to loom over us. I installed security cameras around our house and took extra precautions, but it was hard to shake the feeling of being watched. One night, as I reviewed the footage from the security cameras, I noticed something strange. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, lingered near our mailbox before quickly disappearing into the night. My heart pounded as I realized this could be the person behind the letters. I showed the footage to the police the next day. They increased their patrols around our neighborhood and advised us to remain vigilant. The fear was real, but so was my determination to protect myself and Ava. The investigation continued, and while the police worked to uncover the identity of the person behind the threats, Ava and I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. We refused to let fear dictate our lives, but the tension was a constant undercurrent, a reminder that we were not entirely safe. Despite the police's increased patrols and their review of the CCTV footage, the investigation reached a dead end. The figure captured on the cameras was too obscured to identify, and the letters yielded no fingerprints or other clues. After weeks of fruitless investigation, the police informed us that they were closing the case. "I'm sorry, Ethan," the officer said, his tone genuinely regretful. "We've done all we can, but without more evidence, there's nothing more we can do. Well, keep an eye on things, but officially, the case is closed." I left the station feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. The threats were real and ongoing, but now we were on our own. Ava tried to reassure me as we drove home, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. Back at the house, the mailbox seemed to mock me, a constant reminder of the unknown danger lurking in the shadows. As if on cue, another letter arrived the next day, the same erratic handwriting, the same menacing tone. "You can't escape me, Ethan. Your time is running out." The words sent a chill down my spine. I showed the letter to Ava, her face mirroring my own fear. "We can't keep living like this," she said, her voice trembling. "There has to be something we can do." But what? The police had given up, and we were left to fend for ourselves. The fear was a constant presence, eroding any sense of normalcy we had managed to rebuild. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the night felt like a threat. I reached out to Jacob, my lawyer, to discuss our options. "Is there any legal action we can take to protect ourselves?" I asked, desperation seeping into my voice. Jacob sighed. Without more concrete evidence, there is not much we can do legally. But there are steps you can take to protect yourselves. Beef up your home security, keep a low profile, and document everything. I took his advice to heart, installing more security cameras and reinforcing the locks on our doors and windows. Ava and I tried to keep a low profile, avoiding unnecessary outings and sticking to familiar, safe places. But the letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. You can run, but you can't hide. I will find you. Sleep became elusive, my mind constantly racing with fear and paranoia. Ava was my rock, but I could see the strain it was putting on her too. The fear was taking its toll, wearing us both down. One night, as I sat in the living room, another letter in hand, I felt a surge of anger. I was tired of being afraid, tired of feeling helpless. I can't keep living like this, I said to Ava, my voice filled with determination. We need to do something. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. What do you have in mind? We need to find out who's behind this ourselves, I said. If the police can't help us, then we have to help ourselves. We decided to take matters into our own hands. Ava and I began documenting every detail, trying to find patterns in the letters, anything that might give us a clue. We reviewed the CCTV footage tirelessly, hoping to spot something the police had missed. Every small lead, every tiny detail was a potential breakthrough. We also reached out to a private investigator, someone who could look into the case with fresh eyes and no bureaucratic constraints. The PI, a seasoned professional named Frank, agreed to take on our case, promising to do everything he could to find the person behind the threats. One evening, Frank called with an update. Ethan, I think I might have something. I need you and Ava to come to my office tomorrow morning. His tone was serious, but there was a hint of optimism. I hung up the phone, feeling a surge of anticipation. Maybe, just maybe, we were getting closer to uncovering the truth. That night, for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to hope. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by the possibility of resolution. With Ava by my side and Frank's expertise, I felt a renewed sense of determination. We would find the person behind the threats, and we would put an end to this nightmare once and for all. The next morning, Ava and I arrived at Frank's office, a small nondescript building tucked away on a quiet street. The anticipation was palpable as we sat across from him, waiting for him to reveal what he had uncovered. Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. Ethan, Ava, I think we've finally got a breakthrough. The person sending the letters isn't Abigail. Ava let out a small gasp, and I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Then who is it? I asked, leaning forward. Frank opened a folder on his desk, revealing photos and documents. It's Mason, Abigail's lover. He visited her multiple times at the psychiatric hospital. During these visits, she persuaded him to send the threatening letters to you. My stomach churned at the mention of Mason's name. The man who had been the catalyst for so much pain and betrayal was still wreaking havoc in my life. Why would he do this? What does he gain from threatening me? Frank sighed. From what I've gathered, Mason is deeply infatuated with Abigail. She manipulated him, playing on his emotions and convincing him that you were the source of all her problems. She likely told him that scaring you would somehow make things right for her. Ava shook her head in disbelief. How did he get access to our new address? That's where it gets interesting, Frank continued. He hired a private investigator of his own, who managed to track you down after you moved. Once he had your address, the letters started. The pieces were finally falling into place. The erratic handwriting, the relentless threats, it all made sense now. Mason, driven by his obsession with Abigail and manipulated by her lies, had taken it upon himself to terrorize me. What do we do now? I asked, feeling a mix of anger and determination. Frank smiled grimly. We hand all this evidence over to the police. With this information, they can reopen the case and take action against Mason. He can be charged with harassment and making criminal threats. We left Frank's office with a renewed sense of purpose. Armed with the evidence he had gathered, we went straight to the police station. The officers were initially skeptical, but as Frank laid out the details, they began to see the full picture. This is solid, one of the detectives said, looking over the documents. We'll bring Mason in for questioning. If he admits to sending the letters, we can move forward with charges. The following days were a blur of police interviews and statements. Mason was brought in for questioning, and under the weight of the evidence, he confessed to sending the letters. He admitted that Abigail had convinced him it was the only way to make her happy, to fix the mess she believed I had caused. With Mason's confession, the police had all they needed to press charges. He was arrested for harassment and making criminal threats, and a restraining order was put in place to ensure he could no longer come near Ava or me. As the legal proceedings against Mason unfolded, I felt a heavy weight lifting off my shoulders. The fear that had haunted us for months was finally dissipating. Ava and I could start to rebuild our lives without the constant threat hanging over us.